living silver that breathes with every pulse, refusing to tolerate a single lie. When a magical bond becomes a delicate bridge between two souls, silence speaks louder than words. Could this shimmering thread be the start of something real? Relax and immerse yourself in a love story. The air in the Transfiguration classroom was thick with the scent of old parchment and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone that always preceded a difficult spell. Outside, a relentless Scottish rain lashed against the tall, arched windows of Hogwarts, blurring the silhouette of the forbidden forest into a dark, weeping smudge against the grey sky. Inside, the flickering candlelight danced across the stone walls, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mimic the restless energy of the students within. Draco Malfoy stood at his workstation, his posture as rigid as the silver-topped cane his father favoured. His pale skin looked almost translucent under the enchanted chandeliers, and his knuckles were white as he gripped his wand. Opposite him, Hermione Granger was a whirlwind of controlled focus. Her wild curls were pinned back, though a few stubborn strands had escaped to frame a face set in a mask of grim determination. They were supposed to be practicing Vinculum Mutatio, a complex spell designed to transform heavy iron shackles into ethereal smoke. It was a lesson in liberation, in turning the weight of the physical world into nothingness. But between Draco and Hermione, nothing was ever light. The air between them was a battlefield of unspoken grievances, years of vitriol, and a tension so thick it felt like a physical barrier. "You're holding your wand too tightly, Malfoy," Hermione whispered, her voice a sharp blade in the quiet room. "You're forcing the magic. It needs to flow, not break." Draco's jaw tightened. He didn't look at her, but the pulse in his neck jumped. "I don't recall asking for a lecture from the resident know-it-all, Granger. Focus on your own scrap metal." "I've already vanished mine," she retorted, gesturing to the empty space on her desk. "I'm trying to ensure you don't blow us both to the infirmary." Draco finally turned his head, his cold grey eyes meeting her defiant brown ones. The hatred was there, familiar and comfortable, but beneath it lay something jagged, a raw, frantic exhaustion that he hid behind a sneer. He hated that she saw through his defenses. He hated that she was always right. "Watch me," he hissed. He slashed his wand through the air with a violent, jagged motion. Instead of the rhythmic, flowing incantation McGonagall had demonstrated, Draco spat the words out like a curse. The reaction was instantaneous. The heavy iron chains on his desk didn't dissolve. They screamed. A horrific, metallic screech echoed through the hall as the iron turned a molten, glowing silver. The links began to thrash like a dying serpent, lashing out across the mahogany surface. "Draco, stop!" Hermione cried, reaching out instinctively to pull him back. But it was too late. As her fingers brushed his sleeve, the silver liquid fire leaped from the desk. It didn't strike them. It bound them. In a flash of blinding light that smelled of burnt sugar and ancient earth, the chains coiled around Draco's left wrist and Hermione's right. The impact threw them both backward. They hit the stone floor with a synchronized thud, gasping for air. Silence fell over the classroom, broken only by the frantic patter of rain. Professor McGonagall was there in an instant, her wand drawn, her face pale. "Nobody move," she commanded. Hermione tried to pull her hand away, but the chain tightened. It wasn't just a cold metal grip, it felt alive. The silver links pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow, mimicking a heartbeat. When she tugged harder, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the metal, and the chain nipped at her skin, a sharp, stinging sensation that drew a gasp of pain from her lips. "Don't pull," Draco groaned, his voice strained. He was staring at his wrist in horror. The chain was biting into his flesh too, responding to his internal surge of panic. "What did you do?" Hermione hissed, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of frustration. "What is this?" I don't know," Draco muttered, the arrogance stripped from his voice, leaving only a hollow tremor. McGonagall whispered a dozen counterspells, her wand weaving intricate patterns in the air. Each charm hit the silver links and simply slid off, like water off a swan's back. The chains only grew brighter, humming with a defiant power. "It's a sentient binding," McGonagall finally said, her voice heavy with realization. "Mr. Malfoy, you didn't just fail the transfiguration, you tapped into an ancient subconscious defensive magic. These chains are fed by your emotions. They are enchanted chains of accord." "How do we get them off?" Hermione demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "You don't," a dark, silky voice drawled from the doorway. Severus Snape stepped into the room, his black robes billowing like a shadow. He looked at the bound pair with a mixture of disdain and clinical interest. "Not yet, at least. These chains are designed to enforce a truce. They are sensitive to hostility, resentment, and anger. The more you fight them, and each other, the tighter they will bite." "A week," Snape continued, ignoring Draco's muffled protest. "It will take exactly 7 days for a sempiternus flower to bloom in the dungeons. Only its essence can dissolve this particular brand of accidental magic. Until then, you are physically and somewhat empathetically tethered." The reality crashed down on them. A week, 7 days of being no more than 3 feet apart. "This is a nightmare," Hermione whispered, closing her eyes. "It's a death sentence," Draco added, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He felt a sharp prick on his wrist, the chain's reaction to his bitterness. He winced, his eyes darting to Hermione. She looked small on the floor, her shoulder touching his. He could feel the warmth of her body, a stark contrast to the icy silver binding them. He wanted to push her away, to retreat to the safety of his manor-born isolation, but the chain hissed, a warning rattle that vibrated through his bones. "You will be granted a private set of quarters for the duration," McGonagall said, her tone softening with a hint of pity. "Since you cannot be separated, you will need a space where you can coexist without the scrutiny of your houses. I suggest you start learning how to speak to one another without drawing blood, or this will be a very long 7 days." As the other students were ushered out, some whispering, some laughing, Ron Weasley looking like he was about to explode, Draco and Hermione remained on the floor. The fire in the hearth was dying down, leaving the room in a heavy amber twilight. The rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming. "Help me up," Hermione said, her voice barely audible. Draco looked at her outstretched hand, the one not bound to him. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to sneer, to blame her, to walk away. But the chain tightened around his heart just as much as his wrist. He reached out, his long, pale fingers wrapping around her forearm. He pulled her up, the movement clumsy and forced. As they stood, their bodies were brought close, too close. He He could smell her hair, cinnamon, old books, and the crisp scent of the rain. She smelled like everything he was taught to despise, and yet, in the stifling silence of the classroom, she was the only anchor he had. They stood there for a long moment, bound by silver and spite, watching the shadows grow longer. The chain between them hung in a heavy arc, glowing faintly in the dark. It didn't growl now. It just pulsed, slow and steady, waiting for the first word to be spoken. "Don't think this changes anything, Malfoy," she whispered, though she didn't pull her arm away. "I wouldn't dream of it, Granger," he replied, his voice a ghost of its former self. The chain gave a sharp, sudden tug, pulling their wrists together until their skin touched. A jolt of electricity shot through Draco's arm, a spark of pure, unadulterated magic that made his breath catch. He looked down at their joined hands. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the urge to wash himself clean. He felt a terrifying, hollow ache of curiosity. The week had begun, and the chains were already hungry for more than just their anger. The walk to the temporary quarters felt like a funeral procession for two. Every step was a calculated negotiation. If Draco moved too fast, the silver links snapped taut, biting into Hermione's wrist with a sharp electric hiss that made her hiss in pain. If Hermione lagged behind to adjust her heavy bag, the chain growled, a low metallic vibration that rattled Draco's bones. They were forced into a rhythmic, hauntingly synchronized march through the torch-lit corridors, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a contact that sent jolts of pure defensive adrenaline through them both. The room the headmistress had provided was tucked away in a quiet wing of the castle, far from the boisterous cheers of the Gryffindor common room, or the subterranean damp of the Slytherin dungeons. It was a circular chamber, smelling of dried lavender and beeswax, furnished with two small desks, a shared hearth, and two beds positioned just far enough apart that the chain would remain slack, provided neither of them moved in their sleep. "I'll take the left," Draco snapped the moment the door clicked shut behind them. He didn't wait for her consent, dragging her toward the bed draped in emerald and silver linens. "You don't just take things, Malfoy," Hermione retorted, her voice trembling with the effort of keeping her temper in check. The chain gave a warning throb, the silver glowing a dull, angry red. She winced, rubbing the skin just above the metal. "And I am not sleeping in a den of snakes," we agreed, or rather, McGonagall suggested, we alternate. Tonight is my choice. "I am a Malfoy. I do not sleep on Gryffindor cotton that likely smells of wet dog and ginger," he sneered, stepping closer to her, his height towering over her. The chain didn't just growl this time. It lashed out. A thin silver barb sprouted from a link and nipped Draco's thumb. He swore loudly, jerking his hand back. Simultaneously, Hermione felt a crushing pressure around her wrist, as if an invisible hand was squeezing the bone. "Stop it!" she cried, her eyes stinging. "It's feeding on us. Every time you open your mouth to say something cruel, it hurts us both. Don't you see?" Draco looked down at his bleeding thumb, then at Hermione. Her face was flushed, her chest heaving with silent sobs she refused to let fall. For a fleeting second, the mask of the arrogant aristocrat slipped. He saw the bruises already forming under the silver band on her delicate wrist, bruises he had caused. "Fine," he muttered, the word tasting like ash. The neutral bed, the one by the window. They sat on the edge of the mattress, side by side, the silence between them heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic scratching of a branch against the window pane. Hermione reached for a book in her bag with her free hand, desperate to disappear into a world that made sense. But the movement pulled Draco's arm toward her. "Can you not sit still for 5 minutes?" he hissed, though he kept his tone low, wary of the metal guardian. "I am trying to study, Draco. Some of us actually care about our NEWTS," she snapped back. "And some of us are trying to process the fact that we are tethered to our worst nightmare," he countered, his grey eyes dark with a shadow she couldn't quite identify. Guilt, fear, or perhaps just the exhaustion of a boy who had been a soldier in a war he never wanted to fight. He leaned back against the headboard, closing his eyes. Without the sneer, his face looked startlingly young and hauntingly beautiful in the firelight. The sharp line of his jaw, the pale sweep of his hair. He looked like a fallen angel carved from marble. Hermione found herself staring, her breath hitching in her throat. She quickly looked away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "It's just the magic," she told herself. "The chains are forcing an artificial proximity." But as the hours ticked by, the physical reality of their bond became impossible to ignore. To wash their faces, they had to stand at the stone basin together, their hands moving in a clumsy, mirrored dance. To change into their nightclothes, they had to retreat behind a silk screen, one holding the fabric up while the other fumbled with buttons, their backs turned, skin prickling with the sheer, terrifying intimacy of it all. When it finally came time to sleep, the tension reached a breaking point. They lay on the bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. The chain lay between them on the duvet, a cold silver snake that seemed to watch them. "I can feel your heart beating," Draco whispered into the darkness. Hermione stiffened. "What?" "Through the chain. It's vibrating. You're terrified of me." "I'm not terrified of you, Malfoy. I'm terrified of this." She gestured to the bond. "I'm terrified of what happens when the silence gets too loud." Draco turned onto his side, facing her. The movement brought their faces inches apart. In the dim glow of the dying embers, his eyes were no longer cold. They were swirling storms of grey. "Do you think I wanted this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "To be locked in a room with the girl who reminds me of every failure I've ever had? Every time I look at you, Granger, I see the side of the world that won. And I see the person I was supposed to hate, but who is the only person currently keeping me from falling apart." Hermione reached out, her fingers hovering just above his bound wrist. She didn't touch him, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You don't have to hate me, Draco. The war is over." "Is it?" he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Because it feels like the real battle is just starting." The chain hummed, not a growl but a low melodic purr. It grew warm, a gentle heat that seeped into their skin. For the first time since the accident, the pressure around their wrists eased. Draco's hand drifted toward hers. His fingers were cold, but as they brushed against her palm, a wave of warmth flooded Hermione's senses. It was a tentative, fragile touch. He traced the line of her life mark, his touch as light as a moth's wing. Hermione didn't pull away. Her pulse spiked, not from fear, but from a sudden, dizzying rush of longing. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the cracks in his armor. He wasn't the villain of her childhood anymore. He was a boy drowning in his own legacy, reaching for a hand he had been told was beneath him. Granger, he breathed, his voice thick with a conflict that mirrored her own. Don't, she whispered, though she didn't know if she was asking him to stop or to continue. Suddenly, the fire flared bright blue, a sign that the sempiternus flower in the dungeons had begun to sprout its first leaf. The sudden light startled them. Draco jerked his hand back as if burned, his face instantly resetting into a mask of cold indifference. "Get some sleep, Granger," he said, turning his back to her. "Tomorrow will be worse." The chain, sensing the sudden return of his internal walls, turned ice cold. Hermione shivered, pulling the blankets to her chin. The warmth was gone, replaced by a hollow ache in her chest that was far more painful than the metal's bite. She lay there for a long time, listening to the rain and the steady, deceptive rhythm of Draco's breathing. She knew he wasn't asleep. She could feel his doubt, his shame, and his sudden, sharp regret pulsing through the silver links. They were closer than they had ever been, yet the distance between them felt like an ocean. And as she finally drifted into a fitful sleep, she realized with a start that she wasn't afraid of the chains anymore. She was afraid of the moment they would finally be broken. The second morning arrived not with the gentle glow of dawn, but with the harsh, rhythmic pounding of a headache behind Draco's temples. The room was bathed in a pale, sickly grey light filtered through the rain-streaked windows. He moved his arm instinctively to rub his eyes, but a sharp, metallic jerk stopped him mid-motion. The chain groaned, a dry, grating sound that vibrated against his skin. Hermione was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the bed they had shared in a truce of exhaustion. She was staring at her bound wrist, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She didn't look at him when he sat up, but he felt her flinch through the silver links. The empathy of the magic was growing stronger. He could taste her bitter anxiety like copper on his tongue. "We have double potions first," she said, her voice raspy. "Slughorn expects us. He said he'd have a specialized cauldron for us so we don't trip over each other." "How thoughtful," Draco drawled, the old sarcasm returning as a shield. The great Granger and the Malfoy disgrace, tied together like common livestock. "I'm sure the school will find it riveting." The chain snapped tight, the silver links turning a bruised purple. Hermione gasped, clutching her wrist. "Stop it, Draco. Every time you let your pride speak, it hurts. Just, for once, keep your cynicism to yourself." "My pride is all I have left, Granger," he hissed, his eyes flashing with a sudden, jagged anger. "You wouldn't understand. You're the golden girl. You walk through these halls and people see a hero. They look at me and see a marked boy who failed to be a monster and failed even harder at being a man." The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, charged with the static of his confession. Hermione looked at him then, her gaze softening from irritation to something far more dangerous. Pity. Or perhaps it was recognition. "I don't see a hero when I look in the mirror, Draco," she whispered, leaning slightly toward him. The chain slackened, turning a warm, pale gold. "I see someone who is tired of fighting. I see someone who is terrified that if she stops moving, she'll shatter." For a moment, the distance between them vanished. The silence wasn't a wall. It was a bridge. Draco looked at her lips, then back to her eyes, seeing the reflection of his own brokenness in them. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a stray curl away from her forehead. His skin was cold, but where he touched her, a trail of heat followed. The moment was shattered by a sharp rap on the door. 5 minutes, you two. Ron's voice boomed from the corridor, sounding strained and suspiciously close to the keyhole. And Malfoy, if I hear her scream, I'm breaking that door down, chain or no chain. Draco's hand dropped as if he'd been struck. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a wall of ice. Your watchdog is early, he sneered, standing up and dragging Hermione with him with a callous jerk. The chain screamed, a high-pitched metallic wail that made them both wince. The silver links grew cold, so cold they felt like they were searing into their skin. Potions was an exercise in silent torture. They stood at a long, reinforced table in the back of the dungeon. Slughorn had indeed provided a wide, shallow cauldron, but the logistics of dicing valerian roots while tethered were nearly impossible. Every time Draco reached for a knife, Hermione had to lean in, her chest pressing against his arm, her scent, that maddening mix of vanilla and parchment, filling his lungs. "You're cutting them too thick," she murmured, her hand hovering near his. "I'm doing it fine," he snapped, though his hands were shaking. "Let me." She reached over, her fingers sliding over his to take the knife. The contact was like a lightning strike. Draco didn't pull away. He let her hand cover his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He watched her profile, the concentration in her eyes, the way she bit her lip, and felt a terrifying surge of possessiveness. He wanted to pull her closer. He wanted to push her across the room. The conflict within him was so violent that the chain began to vibrate, a low hum that shook the cauldron. "Malfoy! Granger! Is everything all right?" Slughorn called out, peering over his spectacles. "Fine, Professor," Hermione said, her voice remarkably steady despite the way her pulse was thrumming through the chain. But it wasn't fine. As the lesson progressed, the tension between them became a living thing. When Pansy Parkinson walked by, casting a look of pure venom at Hermione and a lingering, soulful gaze at Draco, he felt Hermione's surge of sudden, inexplicable jealousy. It burned through the bond like acid. "Don't," he whispered, leaning down so only she could hear. "She means nothing. She never did." Hermione looked up, startled. "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to. I can feel you, Hermione. I can feel your heart racing." The use of her first name was a blow. She stumbled back, the movement catching him off guard. They tripped, their legs tangling, and they tumbled toward the floor. Draco twisted his body in mid-air, taking the brunt of the fall, his back hitting the stoned floor with a sickening thud as Hermione landed squarely on his chest. The dungeon went silent. Hermione's hands were splayed across his shoulders, her face inches from his. Draco's breath hitched. He could feel the softness of her, the frantic beat of her heart against his own. The chain between their wrists was glowing with a blinding white light, pulsating with a rhythm that was neither his nor hers, but something combined. "Get off," he gasped, but he didn't move his hands from where they had instinctively gripped her waist. I can't," she breathed, her eyes wide with shock. "The chain. It's not letting me move." The silver links had wrapped themselves around both their arms, pulling them into a tight, inescapable embrace. It wasn't biting now. It was holding them. It was forcing them to acknowledge the heat, the proximity, and the sudden, undeniable spark of desire that flickered in the darkness of their shared animosity. "Malfoy," she whispered, her voice a plea. He looked at her, his grey eyes dark with a hunger he had spent years denying. He saw her fear, but he also saw her curiosity. He saw the way her gaze dropped to his mouth, her own lips parting slightly. "Is this what you wanted, Granger?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "To see me like this? To see me break?" "I don't want you to break, Draco," she said, her voice suddenly fierce. "I want you to be real." The chain tightened one last time, a gentle, insistent squeeze before suddenly slackening. The white light faded into a soft, shimmering silver. They scrambled apart, Draco helping her up with a rough, jerky motion that hid his trembling hands. The class resumed, but the air in the dungeon had changed. The hatred was still there, but it was no longer a solid wall. It was a veil, thin and tattered, fluttering in the wind of a much more powerful emotion. As they left the classroom, Draco didn't look back, but he didn't pull the chain either. He walked at her pace, his shoulder inches from hers, the silver bond hanging between them like a promise they weren't yet ready to keep. Back in their shared room, the atmosphere was stifling. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, damp silence in its wake. Hermione went straight to her desk, her back to him, her head buried in a book she wasn't reading. Draco stood by the window, watching the mist roll over the black lake. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of doubt. Was she just a victim of the magic? Was he? He looked at the chain. It was calm now, a beautiful, deceptive ornament. He knew he should say something cruel. He should re-establish the boundaries. But when he looked at Hermione, at the way the candlelight caught the gold in her hair, all he felt was a crushing, desperate need to know what she was thinking. "Granger," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't turn around. "Yes?" "Tomorrow, the flower. It's supposed to open another leaf." "I know. And then we'll be free." She finally turned, her expression unreadable. "Is that what you want, Draco? To be free?" He looked at the chain, then at her. The answer was a lie he couldn't bring himself to tell. He turned back to the window, his heart a heavy, leaden weight in his chest. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time in his life, it was the absolute truth. The chain hummed, a low, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness in the room. The second day was over, and the shadows were only getting deeper. The third day brought a shift in the weather, the relentless rain giving way to a suffocating, low-hanging fog that clung to the castle battlements. Inside their shared quarters, the air felt just as thick. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grueling domestic intimacy that neither was prepared for. Every movement was a choreographed dance of survival. When Draco brushed his teeth, Hermione had to stand beside him, her reflection in the spotted mirror a ghost that haunted his own. When she reached for her robes, he had to steady her, his hand lingering on her shoulder a second too long, before the chain's warning hum forced him to recoil. By noon, the silence between them had become a living entity, bloated and heavy. They were sitting in the library, relegated to a dusty corner in the restricted section to avoid the prying eyes of students who treated their predicament like a circus act. The scent of old glue and rotting leather surrounded them. You're staring at the same page for 20 minutes, Malfoy, Hermione whispered, her voice cracking the stillness. If you're going to waste the table space, at least let me move the inkwell. Draco didn't look up from the book. His eyes were fixed on an illustration of a medieval torture device, but he wasn't seeing it. I'm thinking, Granger, a concept I'm sure you believe you have a monopoly on. Thinking about what? About how much I loathe the colour red, he said sharply, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles beneath them deeper than the day before. It's everywhere. Your scarf, your ink, your cheeks when you're annoyed. It's loud. It's exhausting. The chain gave a sharp, sudden nip. Draco winced, his hand twitching. The metal didn't just bite anymore. It seemed to be burrowing deeper, seeking the nerves beneath the skin. It only hurts because you're lying, Hermione said softly, closing her book. She leaned in, the chain sliding across the oak table with a sound like dry bones rattling. You don't hate the colour, Draco. You hate that you've stopped hating what it represents. You're fighting yourself, and the chain is just caught in the crossfire. Don't psychoanalyze me, he hissed. But there was no venom in it, only a desperate, hollow fatigue. You know nothing of what I've seen, what I've been forced to be. To you, everything is a puzzle to be solved, a potion to be brewed. But this, the way my skin crawls when you're not looking, and the way it burns when you are, there's no logic in that. He stood up abruptly, dragging her hand with him. The sudden movement sent her inkwell toppling over. Black ink bled across her pristine parchment, swallowing her carefully transcribed notes on ancient runes. "My notes!" she cried, reaching out with her free hand to stop the spread. "Forget the notes!" Draco roared, his voice echoing through the stacks. He gripped her wrist, the one bound to his, and pulled her closer until their chests were almost touching. "Look at me, Granger. Really look at me. I am a mess of scars and bad blood. I am the son of a man who would see you dead. And yet, this cursed silver thing is telling me that you are the only thing in this castle that feels real." Hermione froze. Her breath hitched, her heart thudding so loudly she was sure he could feel it through the metal links. The chain was glowing a violent, pulsing violet, vibrating with such intensity that the pens on the table began to rattle. "Draco," she whispered, her eyes searching his. She saw the terror there, the raw, unadulterated fear of a boy who had finally realized his cage was of his own making. "I can't breathe when you're like this," he muttered, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. It was a gesture of total surrender. The coldness of his skin met the heat of hers, and for a moment the world outside the library disappeared. "I can't think. I spend all night listening to you breathe, wondering if you're dreaming of a world where I don't exist. And the worst part is, I don't want to wake up because then I'd have to go back to being Malfoy. And Malfoy isn't allowed to want you." The chain's glow shifted. The angry violet bled into a soft, shimmering rose. The vibration stopped, replaced by a gentle, rhythmic warmth that flowed through their joined wrists and up their arms, settling in their chests. "Maybe you don't have to be that version of yourself anymore," Hermione said, her hand tentatively coming up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. It was racing, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. "The war ended, Draco. The world changed. Why won't you let yourself change with it? He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression a mask of agony. Because if I change, I lose everything. My name, my family, my place. And what has that place ever given you besides chains? She asked pointedly, gesturing to their wrists. He stared at the silver links. They were beautiful in the dim light, intricate and ancient. At least these chains tell me the truth, he whispered. He leaned in, his lips hovering a fraction of an inch from hers. The tension was a physical weight, a magnetic pull that made every nerve in Hermione's body scream for him to close the gap. She felt her eyelids flutter closed, her hand tightening on his shirt, pulling him closer. Just as the tip of his nose brushed hers, a loud crashing sound erupted from the next aisle over. "Oops, sorry, just dropping some books." Neville Longbottom's voice squeaked, followed by the frantic sound of footsteps running away. The spell was broken. Draco recoiled as if he had been slapped, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red before turning deathly pale. The chain, reacting to his sudden surge of shame and self-loathing, turned ice-cold and contracted with a vicious snap. Hermione cried out as the metal bit deep into her skin, drawing a thin line of blood. "I can't do this," Draco gasped, his eyes wild. He grabbed his things with his free hand, nearly knocking her over as he hurried out of the library, dragging her behind him like a prisoner. The walk back to their room was a nightmare. Draco didn't say a word, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He walked so fast that Hermione had to run to keep up, her wrist throbbing with every heartbeat. Every time she tried to speak, the chain tightened, a cold metallic gag that forbade any further intimacy. When they reached their room, he practically threw himself onto his bed, turning his back to her and pulling the covers over his head. Hermione stood in the center of the room, looking at her bleeding wrist. She felt a wave of cold, sharp anger, not at him, but at the situation, at the chains that punished them for feeling and punished them for not. She sat down at her desk, her back to him, and pulled out a fresh piece of parchment. Her hand was shaking, but she forced herself to write. She didn't look back at the bed, but she could feel him. The chain lay across the floor between them, a long silver shadow. It wasn't humming or glowing. It was silent, heavy, and cold. As the moon rose over the castle, casting silver bars of light across the floor, Hermione realized that the third day had changed everything. The enemy's part of their trope was rotting away, leaving behind something far more dangerous, a need that neither of them knew how to handle. She looked at the small clock on her desk. 4 days left. 4 days of this seesaw of emotions. She wondered if there would be anything left of them by the time the sempiternus flower finally bloomed. In the silence of the room, she heard a muffled, choked sound from Draco's bed. A sob, or just a sharp intake of breath. She reached out, her hand hovering over the chain, but she didn't touch it. She couldn't risk the sting. "I hate you, Malfoy," she whispered to the empty room. The chain didn't move. It didn't bite. It didn't growl. It just lay there, a silver lie between two people who were slowly losing the ability to tell the truth. The fourth day felt like a fever dream. The fog had moved inside the castle, or perhaps it was just the exhaustion clouding their minds. The constant physical presence of the other had become an ache that never quite subsided. They were beyond the point of polite avoidance. They were two souls trapped in a single agonizing rhythm. Hermione woke to the sensation of the chain dragging across her chest. Draco was restless. In the pale light of dawn, she watched him through half-closed eyes. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, his silver blonde hair disheveled. The chain between them was slack, coiled on the mattress like a sleeping viper. It was a dull, leaden grey, reflecting his internal state, a profound, quiet despair. "You're awake," he said, not turning around. He didn't ask. He felt her consciousness prickling through the bond. "I am," she replied, her voice thick with sleep. "Did you sleep at all?" "Sleep is for people with quiet minds, Granger. Mine is currently a riot." He finally turned, and the look in his eyes made her heart skip a beat. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability that was almost too painful to witness. "The chain, it's different today. Can't you feel it?" Hermione sat up, the duvet falling to her waist. She focused on the metal around her wrist. It wasn't cold, and it wasn't biting. It was heavy. A weight that felt as though it were pulling not at her arm, but at her very essence. "It feels inevitable," she whispered. "It feels like a sentence," Draco corrected, his voice dropping to a low melodic vibration. 7 days to undo a lifetime of being taught that you were my enemy. 7 days to realize that I've spent more time thinking about you than I have about my own future. The honesty was a physical blow. The chain hummed a low golden chord, the metal beginning to shimmer with a soft, ethereal light. Hermione reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the silver links. They were warm, comforting even. "We have to go to the greenhouses," she said, trying to anchor herself in the mundane. "Professor Sprout said the sempiternus needs a specific chant today to ensure the nectar is potent enough for the potion." Draco stood, offering her his hand. It was the first time he had done so without a sneer or a command. Hermione took it, and the jolt that sparked between their palms was so intense that the chain flared bright white for a split second. They stood there, hands joined, chests rising and falling in a shared frantic tempo. The tension was no longer about hate. It was about the terrifying proximity of a truth they both feared. The greenhouses were a humid green sanctuary against the cold stone of the castle. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming mandrakes. In the corner, under a shimmering glass bell jar, sat the sempiternus. It was a strange, haunting flower. Its petals were the colour of a bruised twilight, and its stem was wrapped in thorns that looked remarkably like the links of their own chain. "We have to speak to it," Hermione whispered, reading from a small piece of parchment. "Together, we have to voice a shared truth to make it bloom." Draco scoffed, but there was no heat in it. "A shared truth? Between us? We can't even agree on what time to have tea." "It doesn't have to be about tea, Draco," she said, stepping closer to him, the chain clinking softly. "It just has to be true." They leaned over the jar. The flower seemed to lean back, its petals trembling as if in anticipation. "I'll start," Hermione said, her voice steady. "I am tired of being the only one who holds everything together." The flower's petals unfurled slightly. A tiny drop of nectar, clear as a diamond, formed at its heart. Draco looked at the plant, then at Hermione. He swallowed hard, his throat working. "I am tired of pretending that I don't care if the world burns, as long as I'm the one holding the torch." The flower shivered, and another petal opened. The scent it released was intoxicating, a mix of rain on hot stone and the exact smell of Draco's skin. "I'm afraid of what happens when this chain breaks," Hermione admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm afraid it's the only thing that's actually keeping me whole," Draco added, his gaze fixed on her. The sempiternus bloomed fully in a sudden, violent burst of colour, its nectar overflowing. But as the flower reached its peak, a sudden shadow fell over the greenhouse. Pansy Parkinson and Blaise Zabini were standing by the door, their expressions a mix of mockery and sharp, aristocratic coldness. "Look at this," Pansy drawled, her eyes darting between their joined hands and the glowing flower. "The Prince of Slytherin, whispering sweet nothings to a mudblood over a weed. How the mighty have fallen, Draco. Your mother would be devastated." The word hit Draco like a physical lash. The progress they had made, the fragile warmth, vanished in a heartbeat. He felt the weight of his name, the crushing pressure of his lineage, and the old defensive poison rose in his throat. "Don't be ridiculous, Pansy," Draco snapped, his voice turning into a cold, sharp blade. He dropped Hermione's hand as if it were a burning coal. "I'm doing what I have to do to get this filth off my wrist. Do you really think I enjoy being tethered to this?" The chain didn't just bite. It shrieked. A jagged silver barb shot out from the metal, slicing deep into Draco's palm and Hermione's wrists simultaneously. Hermione gasped, the pain so sharp it took her breath away. She looked at Draco, her eyes wide with a betrayal that cut deeper than the metal. "Draco, don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Shut up, Granger," he shouted, his face contorted with a mixture of shame and fury. He was performing for his peers now, retreating into the only role he knew how to play. "I can't wait for this week to be over. I can't wait to never have to look at your pathetic, moralizing face again." The chain turned a dark, pulsing crimson. It began to constrict, the links tightening until the skin beneath turned white and then a sickly blue. The pain was agonizing. Hermione sank to her knees, clutching her arm, tears finally spilling over. "Stop it," she cried. "You're killing us." Pansy laughed, a high, cruel sound, but Blaise looked uneasy, his eyes lingering on the blood dripping from Draco's hand. They eventually turned and left, their footsteps fading into the distance. The silence that followed was broken only by Hermione's quiet sobs and the angry, rhythmic pulsing of the chain. Draco stood over her, his chest heaving, his hand bleeding onto the greenhouse floor. The mask of the cold aristocrat was still there, but it was cracking, showing the raw, bleeding guilt beneath. "Hermione," he started, his voice cracking. "Don't," she said, standing up with a shaky effort. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. "You chose your side, Draco. You always do. You use me when you're lonely, and you kick me when your friends are watching. The chain isn't the problem. You are." The chain gave one last vicious squeeze before settling into a cold, heavy silence. It was no longer glowing. It was a dead weight, a reminder of the chasm that still lay between them. They walked back to their quarters in total silence. The atmosphere in the room was now one of pure, unadulterated cold. Draco retreated to his corner, his back to her, the blood on his hand staining the green silk of his robes. Hermione sat at her desk, her wrist wrapped in a bandage, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The fourth day ended not with a truce, but with a declaration of war. The emotional seesaw had swung back to the dark, and as the moon climbed high above the towers, Hermione wondered if the nectar of the sempiternus would even work. For a potion of reconciliation to work, there had to be something left to reconcile. And right now, all she felt was the cold, biting kiss of the silver, and the even colder realization that she had almost let herself love a ghost. The chain lay between them, a frozen river of metal, waiting for the fifth day to break them completely. The fifth day dawned with a deceptive stillness. A heavy white frost had crept over the castle overnight, turning the window panes into canvases of crystalline thorns. Inside their room, the hearth had gone cold and the air was brittle. Draco had not moved from his chair by the window since the confrontation in the greenhouse. He sat in the shadows, his pale profile etched against the grey light, looking like a statue of a forgotten king. The chain draped across his lap, a heavy, dull umbilical cord connecting him to Hermione, who lay awake on the bed, staring at the canopy. The silence was no longer a bridge. It was a wasteland. The betrayal in the greenhouse had acted like a frost, killing the fragile buds of trust that had begun to form. Hermione felt a hollow ache in her chest that was far more persistent than the throbbing in her wrist. She had expected Draco to be a coward. She had spent years witnessing it. But the raw intimacy of the days prior had made his sudden retreat into malice feel like a physical violation. "I can feel your thoughts, Granger," Draco said, his voice sandpaper dry. He didn't turn around. "They're loud, and they're judging me. It's making the metal itch." "I'm not judging you, Draco," Hermione said, her voice devoid of its usual fire. "I'm mourning you. I thought there was a person under all that armor, but you're just a suit of mail with nothing inside." The chain didn't growl. It didn't nip. It simply grew heavy, unbearably heavy. It felt as if the silver links were turning into lead, pulling their wrists down toward the floor. Draco let out a sharp, choked breath, his hand twitching. The empathetic magic was reflecting their mutual exhaustion. They were both too tired to even be angry. "There is something inside," he whispered, so softly she almost missed it. "But it's a mess. You're a masterpiece of logic and light, Hermione. You have no idea what it's like to be a puzzle where half the pieces were burned before you were even born." He finally turned, and for the first time, she saw the true extent of his internal collapse. His eyes were sunken, and his skin had a grey, waxy sheen. He looked like he was fading away. The chain was no longer shimmering. It was dark, almost black, absorbing the gloom of the room. They were forced to attend a specialized transfiguration session that afternoon. McGonagall watched them with a piercing, concerned gaze as they sat side by side, their bound hands resting on the table like a shared burden. They were meant to be practicing the Harmonia charm, a spell that required two wizards to synchronize their magical signatures. "The chains will not release you if your magic is in discord," McGonagall warned, her voice unusually gentle. "You must find a common frequency, not just in your minds, but in your spirits." They tried. They held their wands, the silver link hanging between them, and attempted to cast the spell. But every time their magic met, it sparked and hissed, creating a foul-smelling smoke. Draco's magic was a jagged, icy blue. Hermione's was a warm, vibrant gold. Instead of blending, they fought, clashing in the air with the sound of breaking glass. "It's no use," Draco spat, throwing his wand onto the table. The chain snapped tight, punishing his outburst by squeezing his bruised palm. He winced, but his expression remained a mask of defiance. "We are opposites. We are the snake and the lion. There is no frequency where we meet." "That's not true," Hermione countered, her eyes flashing. She grabbed his hand, the one bound to hers, and forced him to look at her. "We met in the library. We met when we spoke to the flower." "You just keep running back to the darkness because you're afraid of the light." "I'm not afraid of the light," he roared, standing up and pulling her with him. The classroom was empty now, the other students having fled the tension long ago. "I'm afraid of what the light will show. I'm afraid that if I let myself be real, as you put it, I'll realize that everything I've ever done, every choice I've made, was a mistake. Do you have any idea how much that would hurt?" The chain erupted into a blinding, agonizing heat. It wasn't the warmth of a hearth, it was the fire of a forge. Hermione screamed as the metal seared into her skin. Draco fell to his knees, clutching his chest as if his heart were being squeezed by iron bands. The accord the chains demanded was being refused, and the magic was turning predatory. "Draco, breathe!" Hermione gasped, crawling toward him despite the pain. "Please, just stop fighting it! Stop fighting me!" She threw her arms around him, pulling his head to her shoulder. It was an act of pure desperation, a gamble that physical comfort could override the magical assault. For a moment, Draco remained rigid, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gulps. But as Hermione held him, whispering nonsense words of comfort into his ear, the tension began to leak out of him. He slumped against her, his forehead resting in the crook of her neck. His hands, shaking violently, came up to grip her robes, holding onto her as if she were the only thing keeping him from drifting into the void. The chain's heat began to dissipate. The violent red faded, replaced by a dull, throbbing amber. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Draco's quiet, rhythmic sobbing, a sound so lonely it broke Hermione's heart. She didn't say a word. She just held him, her chin resting on his hair, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his spine. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words muffled against her skin. "I'm so sorry, Hermione. I'm a coward. I'm a fool. I don't know how to be anything else." "You're learning," she whispered, her own tears falling into his blonde hair. "That's what this week is for. You're learning." They stayed like that for a long time, two broken things leaning against each other in the darkening classroom. The chain lay between them, no longer a weapon, but a heavy, quiet witness. When they finally returned to their room, the atmosphere had shifted again. The coldness was gone, replaced by a fragile, aching tenderness. They didn't speak as they prepared for bed. There were no more sneers, no more sharp remarks. When they lay down, Draco didn't turn his back. He stayed on his side, his eyes fixed on Hermione's face. "Stay," he whispered as she moved to adjust the covers. "I'm here," she said. The chain was glowing again, a soft, pulsing violet, like the heart of the sempiternus flower. It was no longer biting. It was humming a low, soothing lullaby that seemed to resonate in their very bones. Hermione reached across the small gap between them, her fingers brushing against his. Draco didn't pull away. He entwined his fingers with hers, their bound wrists resting together on the pillow. The metal was warm, a gentle conductor for the electricity passing between their skin. 2 more days, Hermione murmured, her eyes drifting shut. 2 more days, Draco repeated, his voice heavy with a strange new sorrow. He didn't want the week to end. He realized it with a jolt of terror that made the chain pulse bright. He was afraid of the world without the silver links. He was afraid that without the physical bond, he would lose the courage to be the man he was becoming in this room. As he watched Hermione fall into a deep, peaceful sleep, Draco felt a surge of protectiveness he had never known. He watched the way her eyelashes cast long shadows on her cheeks, the way her lips parted slightly as she breathed. He leaned in, his breath ghosting over her forehead, but he didn't kiss her. Not yet. The chain wasn't ready. He wasn't ready. But the 6th day had done its work. The enemies were gone, buried under the weight of shared tears and the searing heat of the forge. All that was left were 2 souls, tethered by silver, and a growing, terrifying need for the other. The moon cast a silver path across the bed, highlighting the chain that bound them. It looked less like a shackle now, and more like a bridge. And as the clock struck midnight, marking the beginning of the 6th day's end, the silver links began to vibrate with a new, anticipatory rhythm. The final shift was coming. The 6th day felt like the world was holding its breath. The frost on the windows had thickened into intricate, frozen forests, and the castle was submerged in a silence so profound it felt heavy. Within the confines of their room, the atmosphere had reached a state of high-pressure stillness. They moved through the morning like ghosts, the clink of the silver chain the only thing tethering them to the physical world. Hermione felt as though she were walking on the edge of a precipice. Every time her skin brushed against Draco's, a spark ignited, a mixture of terrifying anticipation and raw, aching longing. The seesaw had stopped swinging. It was tilted precariously toward a heat that neither of them knew how to extinguish. Draco was different today. The coldness had been replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. He didn't look away when their eyes met. Instead, he held her gaze with a searing honesty that made her pulse flutter like a trapped bird. They spent the afternoon in the dungeons, preparing the final stage of the Sempiternus potion. The air was damp and smelled of earth and old magic. Snape had left them alone, his absence a silent acknowledgement that the magic binding them was now beyond his interference. "We need to stir it counterclockwise, exactly 7 times, Hermione whispered, her hand trembling as she held the glass rod. "Let me help," Draco said. He didn't wait for an answer. He moved behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his arms reaching around her to place his hands over hers on the rod. The contact was electric. Hermione's breath hitched as she felt the solid warmth of him, the rhythmic thrum of his heart against her shoulder blades. The chain between their wrists lay coiled on the table, glowing with a soft, steady amber light. It wasn't biting. It was humming, a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to synchronize their very heartbeats. Together, he breathed into her ear. As they stirred, the potion shifted from a murky grey to a brilliant, iridescent silver. The scent of the room changed, the dampness evaporated, replaced by the smell of wood smoke, old books, and the sharp, clean scent of the winter air. It was the smell of him. "It's done," she murmured, though she made no move to pull away. "Not quite," Draco replied, his voice a low growl. He turned her in the small space between the table and his body. His hands slid up her arms, his thumbs tracing the line of the silver chain before resting on her shoulders. The potion is ready, but we aren't. What do you mean? The chain. It's not just holding us, Hermione. It's waiting for us. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. I've spent my whole life being told that people like you were the enemy, that you were less. But this week, these chains, they've shown me that the only thing less about you is how much hate you have in your heart compared to mine. Draco. I don't want to drink it, he confessed, his voice breaking. I don't want to go back to the way it was, to being the Malfoy you despise, to being the boy who has to look away when you walk by. Hermione reached up, her fingers grazing his jaw, her touch feather-light. You won't have to. You've changed, Draco. You can't go back to a room that no longer fits you. The chain flared bright white, a surge of heat passing through them both. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming. A flood of shared memories, fears, and the sudden, sharp realization of their mutual desire. The metal began to vibrate with a frantic, metallic rattle, reacting to the intensity of their connection. It's too much, Draco gasped, pulling back slightly, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp doubt. How can this be real? It's a spell. It's a mistake. We're only here because we have to be. The seesaw took one final violent swing toward repulsion. Draco's old fears, the fear of being weak, the fear of his father's shadow, rushed back. He jerked his hand away, the movement so sudden that the chain snapped taut, biting deep into Hermione's wrist. "No!" she cried out, the pain sharp and cold. "I can't!" Draco shouted, his face contorting into a mask of anguish. "I can't be what you want. I'm a Malfoy. I'm tainted. You're better off without these chains, and you're certainly better off without me." He turned and fled the dungeon, dragging Hermione with him. The walk back to the towers was a blur of stumbling steps and the harsh, rhythmic clanging of the metal. The chain had turned into a frozen, jagged thing, its surface covered in tiny silver thorns that drew blood from both their wrists. The empathy was gone, replaced by a wall of jagged glass. They reached their room, and Draco slammed the door, pacing the floor like a caged animal. "We drink the potion at dawn," he snapped, his voice cold and distant. "And then, we never speak of this again. Do you understand, Granger? This was a fluke, a magical accident." Hermione stood by the bed, her heart breaking. She looked at her bleeding wrist, then at the man who had held her so tenderly only moments before. "Is that what you really want, Draco? To go back to the lie?" "The lie is safer," he yelled. He threw himself into his chair, turning his back to her once more. The chain lay across the floor, a dark, cold line in the moonlight. The warmth was gone. The hope was gone. The 7th day was approaching, and it felt like a funeral. Hermione lay down on the bed, her back to him, her silent tears soaking the pillow. She felt the heavy, leaden weight of the chain, and for the first time, she hated it. She hated that it had given her a glimpse of something beautiful, only to snatch it away. As the hours ticked toward midnight, the room grew colder. The fire in the hearth died down to a few glowing embers. The 7th day had begun, and the tension in the room was so thick it was hard to breathe. There were two people bound by silver, yet separated by a world of fear. But as she drifted into a fitful sleep, she felt a slight tug on the chain, a tentative, almost imperceptible movement. Draco had moved his hand closer to the center of the bed. Even in his fear, even in his retreat, he was reaching for her in the dark. The chain gave a faint, almost invisible pulse of rose-gold light. The final shift was coming, and it wouldn't be decided by a potion. It would be decided by the truth they were both too terrified to speak. The seventh day arrived not with a bang, but with the suffocating weight of an ending. The morning sun, pale and wintry, bled through the frost on the windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. On the mahogany table sat the vial of sempiternus potion, its iridescent silver liquid swirling with a life of its own. It was the key to their freedom, the end of their sentence. Yet, neither of them moved toward it. They had spent the night in a state of agonizing consciousness, aware of every breath, every shift of weight from the other. The chain lay between them on the bed, cold and silent, a dead thing that had exhausted its capacity for rage. Draco sat on the edge of the mattress, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched as if under the weight of the entire castle. Hermione sat opposite him, her eyes fixed on the silver links that had become a part of her skin. "It's time," Draco said, his voice a ghost of its former arrogance. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. The vulnerability he had shown in the dungeons had left him raw, his defenses stripped away like old bark. "I know," Hermione whispered. They stood up in unison, the chain clinking with a hollow, mournful sound. They moved toward the table, their movements sluggish, as if the air itself had turned to honey. Draco reached for the vial, his fingers trembling. He uncorked it, and the scent of rain and crushed violets filled the air, the scent of the truth they had tried to bury. "On three?" he asked, his grey eyes finally meeting hers. They were filled with a profound, terrifying sadness. "Draco, wait!" Hermione said, her hand reaching out to cover his. The contact, even now, sent a jolt through her. The chain hummed, a low, melodic vibration that felt like a plea. It wasn't biting. It wasn't glowing. It was simply waiting. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "This is what we wanted, isn't it? To be free of each other, to go back to our lives where everything is simple and everyone knows their place. Is that what you want?" she challenged, her voice rising with a sudden, desperate strength. "To go back to being a shadow in the halls? To pretending that this week never happened? To looking at me and seeing an enemy instead of this?" "I don't see an enemy," he roared, slamming the vial down on the table, though he didn't let go of her hand. "I see everything I can't have. I see a girl who is braver than I'll ever be, who sees the world in colours I didn't know existed. I see the only person who ever looked at me and didn't see a Malfoy or a Death Eater, but just me. And it terrifies me, Hermione. It terrifies me because I don't know how to keep you once this metal is gone." The chain erupted. A blinding, brilliant white light flooded the room, so intense that they both had to shield their eyes. It wasn't the heat of the forge or the bite of the barb. It was a pure, cleansing radiance. The metal links began to glow with a heat that was indistinguishable from the warmth of a summer sun. They felt the empathy, every ounce of it, rushing through the bond. His fear of loss, her fear of rejection, his hidden longing, her unspoken hope. It all swirled together in a violent, beautiful storm of emotion. "It's not a mistake," Hermione cried over the humming of the magic. "The potion. It's not for the chains, Draco. It's for us. I don't need a potion to know I love you, he shouted, the truth finally breaking through the last of his pride like a dam bursting. The world seemed to stop. The light didn't fade, but it softened, turning into a warm, rose-coloured haze. Draco's hands moved from the table to her face, his palms cupping her cheeks with a tenderness that made her breath catch. He looked at her with an intensity that was almost holy, his eyes searching hers for a confirmation he didn't think he deserved. "Say it again," she whispered, her hands gripping his wrists. "I love you," he repeated, his voice steady now, anchored by the weight of the confession. "I've loved you since the 3rd year, when you punched me, and I realized you were the only person alive who wasn't afraid to tell me I was a fool. I've loved you in the dark, in the silence, and in the middle of a war I never wanted. And I'm so sorry it took a cursed chain to make me brave enough to say it." Hermione didn't answer with words. She pulled him down, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was 7 years in the making. It was a collision of everything they had been and everything they were becoming. It tasted of salt and ginger, of rain and redemption. It was desperate and soft, a frantic negotiation of 2 souls finally finding their way home. The moment their lips touched, a sound like 1,000 crystal bells chiming echoed through the room. The weight on their wrists vanished. They pulled apart, gasping for air, and looked down. The silver chain was gone. It hadn't dissolved. It had transformed. A fine, shimmering silver dust lay on the floor, sparkling like fallen stars. In its place, around each of their wrists, was a faint, glowing silver line, not a shackle, but a mark, a permanent, magical tether that only they could see. "It was a spell of accord," Hermione whispered, her voice thick with wonder. "It wasn't a mistake Draco made in class. It was a dormant magic in the castle that responds to unresolved conflict. It couldn't be removed because we weren't reconciled. Not with each other, and not with ourselves." Draco looked at his wrist, then at hers. He reached out and traced the silver mark on her skin. It was warm to the touch. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. "I suppose we don't need the potion then," he said, glancing at the silver vial. "No," Hermione said, stepping back into his arms. "I think we've had enough magic for 1 week." He leaned down and kissed her again, this time with a slow, lingering passion that spoke of late nights in the library and secret walks by the lake. There were no growls, no bites, no warnings. There was only the steady, rhythmic pulse of 2 hearts finally beating in sync. Outside, the frost began to melt, the sun finally breaking through the clouds to bathe the castle in a golden, hopeful light. The week was over, and the chains were broken. But as Draco held her close, listening to the quiet hum of the silver mark on his wrist, he knew that they were more bound than they had ever been. And for the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy didn't want to be free. "So," he murmured against her hair, a hint of his old wit returning. "Does this mean I have to sit with the Gryffindors at breakfast?" Hermione laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that filled the room. "Only if you want to, Malfoy. Only if you want to." "With you?" he asked, pulling her closer. "I'd sit in the Forbidden Forest." They stayed there for a long time, watching the dust of the enchanted chains dance in the sunlight. 2 enemies who had found a love that was stronger than any spell. The war was over, The school was safe, and for Draco and Hermione, the story was only just beginning. The transition from the sanctuary of their private quarters to the predatory gaze of the Great Hall felt like stepping from a warm hearth into a blizzard. Though the physical silver links had vanished, the phantom weight of them still pulled at Hermione's wrist. She found herself walking with her right arm slightly stiff, her body instinctively compensating for a tether that was no longer there. Beside her, Draco walked with a measured, predatory grace, his chin tilted high, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his internal siege. As they approached the massive oak doors of the hall, the roar of hundreds of voices seeped through the cracks. Hermione stopped, her breath hitching. The silver mark on her wrist, the faint, shimmering line that only they could see, began to pulse with a steady, rhythmic heat. It wasn't the bite of the old chains. It was a heartbeat. His heartbeat. "They're going to stare," she whispered, her fingers curling into the fabric of her robes. Draco paused, his shoulder inches from hers. He didn't look at her, but he reached down, his hand brushing against hers in the shadow of their cloaks. His fingers were cold, but the contact ignited a wildfire of reassurance. "Let them stare, Granger. I've spent my life being watched for all the wrong reasons. For once, I'd like them to see something that isn't a lie." The doors swung open. The silence was instantaneous. It rippled from the Gryffindor table to the Slytherin benches like a physical wave, quenching the laughter and the clatter of cutlery. Hundreds of eyes fixed on them, on the Gryffindor princess and the Slytherin heir walking in perfect, unforced synchronization. They didn't head for their respective tables. Instead, Draco led her toward a neutral stretch of stone at the far end of the hall, near the staff table, where the shadows were deeper and the air was cooler. As they sat, the whispering began, a low, buzzing hiss that filled the cavernous space. Hermione felt the familiar prickle of tears, the old vulnerability of being the center of a storm she hadn't asked for. But then, she felt a shift in the air. Draco wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her, his grey eyes softened into a silver mist she had once thought impossible. "Eat," he commanded gently, pushing a plate of toast toward her. "You're pale. If you faint now, Weasley will think I've poisoned you, and I really don't have the energy for a duel before arithmancy." A small, genuine laugh escaped her, breaking the tension in her chest. She took a piece of toast, her eyes locked on his. The non-verbal intimacy they had forged in isolation was now their only shield. A look, a slight tilt of the head, the way he rested his hand on the table just inches from hers. It was a silent language that excluded everyone else in the room. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Ron Weasley, his face a shade of red that matched his hair, stood up from the Gryffindor table. He walked toward them, his movements jerky with suppressed fury. Behind him, Harry followed, his expression a mix of caution and deep, searching concern. "What is this, Hermione?" Ron demanded, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the hall. He didn't look at Draco. He looked at her as if she were a stranger. "The week is over. The chains are gone. Why are you sitting with him?" Hermione felt Draco stiffen beside her. She felt the coldness beginning to radiate from him, the old Malfoy defense mechanism, the urge to sneer and strike back. She reached out under the table, finding his hand and squeezing it hard. "Haven't changed. We spent 7 days haven't changed. We spent 7 days learning how to speak without hurting each other. I'm not going to throw that away because it's inconvenient for everyone else's expectations. He's a Malfoy, Ron hissed, finally glaring at Draco. He's a snake. He's probably used some kind of dark Slytherin glamour on you. Draco stood up then. He didn't reach for his wand. He didn't sneer. He stood with a quiet, devastating dignity that made Ron stumble back a step. "I've used no magic on her, Weasley," Draco said, his voice low and dangerous, yet controlled. "The only magic in this room is the fact that she's willing to look at me at all. If you want to be angry at me. But don't you dare suggest she isn't capable of making her own choices." He turned his wrist upward. The silver mark flared for a brief second, a brilliant, defiant flash of light that caught the reflection of the enchanted ceiling. Harry stepped forward, his green eyes scanning both of them. He saw the way Hermione's hand was still hidden under the table, anchored to Draco's. He saw the lack of fear in her eyes. "It's an accord, isn't it?" Harry asked quietly. "The marks, they didn't just break, they transformed." "It's a choice, Harry," Hermione replied, her gaze softening. "Every day is a choice now." The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted. Ron looked between them, his mouth working but no words coming out. He looked defeated, confused, and deeply hurt, but the blind rage had been replaced by a stunned realization. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. Harry stayed for a moment longer, giving Hermione a small, sad nod of understanding before following his friend. As the hall returned to a dull roar of renewed gossip, Draco sat back down. He looked exhausted, the silver grey of his eyes clouded with a sudden, sharp doubt. "You should have gone with them," he murmured, staring at his empty plate. "It would have been easier." "I don't want easy, Draco," she said, reaching out to openly take his hand on top of the table. The sight of their joined fingers, pale against tanned, slender against strong, sent a fresh shockwave through the room. "I want you." The silver mark on his wrist pulsed a vibrant, warm gold. The seesaw of their relationship had finally leveled, finding a balance in the face of the world's judgment. But as the day wore on, Hermione realized that the Great Hall was only the beginning. The castle was a small world, but the world outside was vast and unforgiving. Later that evening, as they walked toward the library, no longer bound by metal but by a gravity of their own making, they passed a window overlooking the grounds. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. "My mother sent an owl," Draco said abruptly, stopping in the shadows of a stone archway. He pulled a crumpled piece of parchment from his pocket. "She knows. The rumors have reached the manor." Hermione felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "And?" "She wants us to come. This weekend." He looked at her, his expression a battlefield of fear and protective instinct. "She says a Malfoy must account for his attachments." "Hermione, you don't have to. I can go alone. I can end this before it hurts you." "End what, Draco?" she asked, stepping into his space, her hands finding the lapels of his robes. "The truth. You said it yourself. You're tired of the lies." "The manor is. It's full of ghosts, Hermione, especially for you." His voice was a pained whisper. "I won't have you walk back into that nightmare for me." "I'm not walking back into a nightmare," she said, leaning up until their foreheads touched. "I'm walking into your life." And I'm not doing it alone. The silver marks on their wrists hummed in unison, a low, powerful chord of defiance. The enchanted chains had done more than reconcile two enemies. They had forged a bond that was beginning to thrive on the very friction that should have destroyed it. As they stood in the darkening corridor, the air between them thick with the scent of old stone and the promise of a difficult future, Draco leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss of salt and steel, of fear and found courage. It was a promise that whatever ghosts waited in the manor, they would face them together. The ninth part ended with the realization that the internal conflict was over, but the war for their right to exist together had just begun. The shadows of the castle seemed to lengthen, reaching out toward the weekend ahead, where the cold halls of Malfoy Manor waited to test the strength of their new invisible chains. The iron gates of Malfoy Manor did not screech as they swung open. They moved with a silent, oiled lethality that made Hermione's skin crawl. The fog here was different from the misty breath of the Highlands. It was a heavy, white shroud that smelled of damp boxwood and centuries of stagnant secrets. As they walked up the long gravel path, the white peacocks ghosted through the gloom like restless spirits, their haunting cries echoing against the high stone walls. Draco's hand was a vice around hers. Through the invisible bond of the accord, Hermione could feel his internal landscape, a jagged mess of static, cold terror, and a fierce, protective rage that was keeping him upright. Every step toward the blackened silhouette of the manor felt like a step back into a past she had tried to bury under piles of books and logic. "You don't have to go through the front doors," Draco whispered, his voice barely audible over the crunch of gravel. "We can turn back. I can take you to the gate, and you can apparate to the burrow. I'll handle her." Hermione stopped. She turned to face him, the wind whipping her curls across her face. The silver mark on her wrist was glowing a sharp, defensive white. "Draco, look at me." He met her eyes, and the sheer agony in his expression nearly broke her. He wasn't just afraid for her. He was ashamed. He was ashamed of the house, of the history, and of the blood that ran through his veins. "I am not the girl who was dragged here in the dark," she said, her voice like tempered steel. "I am the woman who chose to walk here with you. If we turn back now, we let the ghosts win. And I've had enough of losing to shadows." Draco swallowed hard, his thumbs stroking the back of her hand. "You are the most terrifying creature I have ever met, Granger." "Good," she whispered. "Keep that in mind." The entrance hall was a cathedral of cold marble and emerald shadows. The air was deathly still, smelling of beeswax and something ancient, the scent of old money and older blood. Standing at the foot of the grand staircase was Narcissa Malfoy. She was draped in black silk, her hair a silver gold crown, her face a mask of aristocratic poise that revealed absolutely nothing. "Mother," Draco said, his voice echoing in the vast space. He didn't let go of Hermione's hand. In fact, he lifted it slightly, making the join impossible to ignore. Narcissa's gaze flickered down to their hands, then up to Hermione's face. There was no vitriol in her eyes, only a terrifying clinical curiosity. "Draco, Miss Granger." "Lady Malfoy," Hermione replied, inclining her head just enough to be polite, but not an inch more. "Tea is served in the drawing room," Narcissa said, her tone as dry as autumn leaves. The word drawing room hit Hermione like a physical blow. Her heart spiked, a frantic, rhythmic thudding, that sent a surge of heat through the accord. The room where Bellatrix had held the knife. The room where the floor had tasted of her own blood. She felt the world tilt, the walls of the entrance hall suddenly closing in. Draco felt it instantly. The silver mark on his wrist pulsed a warning red. He stepped in front of her, his body a solid barrier between her and the hallway leading to that room. "No," Draco said, his voice dropping into a register that made even Narcissa blink. "Not the drawing room. We will sit in the solarium, or we will leave now." Narcissa's eyes narrowed, a flash of something, perhaps pride, perhaps shock, crossing her features. She looked at her son, seeing the man who was finally standing his ground against the architecture of his own trauma. "The solarium, then. Follow me." The solarium was a glass-walled sanctuary filled with exotic, pale plants that thrived in the moonlight. It was the only room in the manor that felt like it belonged to the living. As they sat on the high-backed velvet chairs, a house elf appeared, trembling as it set down a silver tea service. The rumours at the ministry are quite colourful. Narcissa began, her fingers deftly moving among the porcelain. They speak of a magical mishap, a chain of accord. They say it was an accident of transfiguration. "It started as an accident," Draco said, his voice steady as he took a cup and handed it to Hermione. He didn't look at the tea, he looked at his mother. "But the fact that it hasn't faded, the fact that the mark remains, is not an accident. It is a choice." Narcissa paused, the teapot hovering in the air. She looked at the silver line on Draco's wrist, then at the identical one on Hermione's. "An accord of souls. It is a very old, very rare magic, Miss Granger. It requires a level of fundamental honesty that most people in our circles spend their lives avoiding. Honesty wasn't an option for us for a long time," Hermione said, her voice growing stronger as she felt Draco's warmth beside her. "But the chains didn't give us a choice. They forced us to see the person behind the blood status. And I found that the person behind the Malfoy name is someone I refuse to lose." Narcissa looked at Hermione, really looked at her, for a long, silent minute. The tension in the room was a living thing, a silver wire pulled to the breaking point. Then, Narcissa did something entirely unexpected. She reached across the table and placed her hand, cold and bone-thin, over the silver mark on Draco's wrist. "Your father would call this a betrayal," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "He would call it the end of our line." "And what do you call it, Mother?" Draco asked. Narcissa looked at Hermione, and for a fleeting second the mask slipped. Hermione saw a woman who had spent years watching her son wither in a war he didn't want. A woman who had lied to the Dark Lord himself to save her child. "I call it survival," Narcissa said, withdrawing her hand. "I spent my life trying to keep you safe within these walls, Draco. I didn't realize that the only way for you to be truly safe was to find someone who would help you tear them down." She picked up her tea, her movements once again perfect. "The tea is getting cold. Miss Granger, I understand you have a penchant for rare books. The Malfoy Library has several first-edition scrolls on arithmancy that might interest you. Draco will show you after we finish." It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't an apology. But in the cold, haunted halls of Malfoy Manor, it was a revolution. As they left the solarium later that evening, the moon was high, casting silver bars across the dark corridors. They passed the heavy oak doors of the drawing room. Hermione stopped, her breath hitching. She looked at the doors, the wood dark and forbidding. Draco didn't pull her away. He stood with her, his hand anchored in hers. "We can burn it," he whispered. "When this house is mine, I will burn this room to the ground and plant a garden in its place." Hermione looked at him, her heart overflowing with a fierce, burning love. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "No," she said softly. "Don't burn it. Let's just open the windows. Let the light in until the shadows have nowhere left to hide." The silver marks on their wrists hummed together, a low, resonant chord of peace. The seesaw of their visit had ended not in a crash, but in a quiet, steady climb. They walked out of the manor, past the white peacocks and the iron gates, no longer looking back at the nightmare. As they apparated back to the outskirts of Hogsmeade, the cold winter air felt clean and sweet. They stood on the hill overlooking the lights of the castle, the accord between them glowing like a private constellation. "One more step," Draco said, pulling her into his arms. "One more step," she agreed, leaning into him. The 10th part ended with the realization that the past no longer held the power to chain them. They had faced the manor and survived, not as victims, but as a force. And as they walked back toward the school, the silver lines on their wrists pulsed with a promise. The final accord was near, and it would be written in their own words, on their own terms. The final night at Hogwarts arrived with the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant, melodic hum of the end-of-term feast. But Draco and Hermione were not in the Great Hall. They had sought sanctuary in the Astronomy Tower, the highest point of the castle, where the air was thin and the stars felt close enough to touch. The stone battlements were cool beneath their hands, and below them the black lake was a sheet of obsidian reflecting the silver sliver of the moon. The atmosphere was heavy with the bitter-sweet ache of transition. In the morning, the Hogwarts Express would carry them away from the only world they had ever known, a world that had seen them as enemies, then as prisoners, and finally as something that defied definition. Draco stood by the rampart, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the wind tugging at his pale hair. He looked out over the grounds, his expression unreadable. The silver mark on his wrist was a constant, gentle glow in the darkness, a tether that hummed with every beat of Hermione's heart. "I used to come up here to feel powerful," Draco said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet night. "To look down on everyone and remind myself that I was above them. Now I just look down and realize how small I was, how lonely." Hermione stepped up beside him, her shoulder brushing his. The contact was no longer a shock, it was a homecoming. "We were both lonely, Draco. We just filled the silence with different things. I filled mine with rules, and you filled yours with walls." He turned to her, his grey eyes luminous in the starlight. He reached out, his fingers tracing the silver line on her wrist. The accord had changed over the months. It was no longer a frantic, defensive pulse. It was a deep, resonant warmth, a shared language of the soul. "The chains are truly gone, aren't they?" he whispered. "Not just the metal, but the weight of who we were supposed to be." "We broke them, Draco," she said, leaning into him. "One link at a time." The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with the weight of things left to say. The seesaw of their journey had finally found its equilibrium, a perfect balance between two souls that had survived the forge. Draco reached into the pocket of his trousers, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out a small velvet pouch. When he opened it, there was no flash of Malfoy diamonds, no heavy gold crest of a family that had once prided itself on blood purity. Instead, he drew out a delicate band of pale, shimmering silver. It looked like it had been woven from moonlight, its surface etched with the same intricate, swirling patterns as the accord marks on their wrists. "I didn't take this from the vault," Draco said, his voice trembling slightly. "I went to the old forge in the cellar of the manor, the one my grandfather used to make charms for the house. I melted down the silver links of the practice shackles I used for transfiguration. I spent weeks trying to get the frequency right." Hermione's breath hitched. She looked at the ring, then at him. "You made this." "I wanted something that belonged only to us," he said, taking her hand. "Not a legacy, not a burden, just a promise. Hermione, I don't know what the world outside these walls will hold for us. I know there will be people who never forgive me and people who think you've lost your mind. But I know that as long as I have this mark on my wrist and your hand in mine, I am exactly where I am meant to be." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the silver warming instantly against her skin. The moment it settled, the marks on their wrists flared with a brilliant, blinding rose gold light. The two lines of light drifted from their skin, swirling together in the air between them, weaving into a single, unbreakable cord of pure magic before dissolving into their chests. The final accord was sealed. It was no longer a spell cast upon them. It was a bond created by them. "I love you, Draco," Hermione whispered, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Not because of the magic, but because you're the only person who ever challenged me to be more than just a girl with a book." Draco didn't answer with words. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was a symphony of everything they had endured. It was the heat of the first bite of the chain, the cold of the library, the vulnerability of the greenhouse, and the triumph of the manor. It was a slow, deep burn that claimed every part of them. He lifted her, her legs tangling around his waist as he pressed her back against the cool stone of the tower. The world below, the feast, the houses, the history, faded into nothingness. There was only the scent of jasmine, the prickle of the wind, and the absolute, terrifying beauty of belonging to another person. "Stay with me," he gasped against her neck. "Tonight, tomorrow, always." "Always," she breathed. They sank to the floor of the tower, hidden from the world by the high stone walls. In the quiet of the night, they talked about the future, not as a series of obstacles, but as a blank parchment waiting for their ink. Draco spoke of restoring the Malfoy lands to something that fed the people instead of starving them. Hermione spoke of laws that would ensure no child was ever judged by their blood again. As the first hint of dawn began to grey the horizon, they lay together, draped in Draco's cloak. The silver marks on their wrists were quiet now, a soft, steady hum like the purr of a contented cat. The story of the enchanted chains had ended. The metal had been melted down, the poison had been drained, and the anger had been spent. What remained was a love that had been tested in the fires of hate and found to be indestructible. They walked down the spiral stairs of the tower one last time, their hands joined. As they stepped into the entrance hall, they saw the morning sun hitting the floor where the chains had first bound them. Draco paused, looking at the spot. He squeezed her hand, and Hermione squeezed back. "Are you ready, Mr. Malfoy?" she asked, a playful spark in her eyes. "To face the world with the brightest witch of her age?" He leaned down, stealing one last lingering kiss. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." They walked through the front doors of the castle and out into the light of a new day. The train was waiting, the world was calling, and for the first time, the path ahead was clear. They were no longer bound by silver, they were bound by a choice, and that was the greatest magic of all.
Thank you so much for listening to this story. Writing about Draco and Hermione is always special to me. For them, the silver chains were not just magic, they were a mirror. The chains showing them that their anger was just a cover for their fears. Sometimes we all build walls around our hearts. We use cold words to stay safe. But this story reminds us that being brave is not about fighting. Being brave is about showing your true self to someone else. It is about letting the light in. I hope you enjoyed this journey from hate to love. I hope you felt the magic. I hope you felt of the castle and the warmth of their growing bond. What was your favorite moment? Please tell me in the comments. I love reading your thoughts. Until next time, keep believing in magic. Goodbye for now.